Beneath Montana soil, a tunnel held more than rock. It held secrets. A Marine veteran followed his German Shepherd into its depths only to find steel buckling fans cut silent and a voice on the radio already declaring them dead. Someone wanted the truth buried. But when explosions shook the earth, Ranger led them through a gap no map admitted, saving lives by inches. Wonder how a dog's instinct brought light to the surface and a guilty man to justice smashed the like button and subscribe for stories that prove loyalty never breaks. Jack Rourke was halfway through winding his old pocket watch when the landline on his kitchen wall began to ring that steady bell like a schoolhouse from another century. He stood in socks on the cool tile, the evening's last light folded neatly behind the curtains, the smell of coffee hanging on as if it had somewhere else to be. Outside, late winter Montana had sharpened itself, stars pricking through thin cloud, the cottonwoods quiet as if listening. Ranger lifted his head from the braided rug, ears flicking before the second ring eyes, a warm, steady amber that held the calm of long miles and hard lessons. Jack glanced at the clock, then at the dog. "Not for us," he murmured, but he picked up anyway because a Marine who's been in charge of collapses knows that not answering is its own decision. "Rourke," he said, and his voice entered the line without hurry. The sheriff didn't waste time. "Jack, I wish I were calling you about a parade," said Ed Talbot, the kind of county man who wore a tie only for funerals. "I've got a situation up near the old Briar Hollow Spur. Crew didn't check back on time. Their supervisor says it's a comms issue, but I'm not betting lives on optimism." Jack closed his eyes and saw a procession of tunnels he'd known by feel and sound, the soft tick of rock under strain, the way air changes flavor, when a void opens, faces smeared with dust above collarbones tattooed by fatigue. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Ed, I'm retired. You got county search and rescue. You got engineers on retainer. I have enthusiasm," Ed said dryly. "What I don't have is anyone who's crawled inside a dying space and heard it breathe. You have. And the wind's turning. It's going to sheet ice by dawn." Ranger stood now, padding to the door as if the call itself had weight. He rested his jaw against Jack's thigh the way he'd done once in Helmand, when a mud wall had lurched and the whole world tilted. Jack's hand found the ridge between Ranger's ears like a habit. He looked at the watch, then the wall where his mother's walnut cross hung a small dark promise that you did what you could with what you'd been given. "How many?" Jack asked. "2 definitely inside," Ed said. "Maybe 3. Contractor's cagey." "Contractor's always cagey." Jack muttered, a small heat kindling under his steady tone, but he let it die down. He asked about access roads, about the last check-in, about what kind of shoring the company claimed it had done. Ed answered in the clipped sentences of a man who knew he was asking for a favor bigger than the county budget. "If I come," Jack said, "I come how I come. I'm not saluting a clipboard or waiting on a green light from some project manager who thinks rock is a PowerPoint." "You come how you come," Ed agreed. "And Jack, bring the dog." The line clicked down to a quiet that seemed to expand, filling the kitchen. Jack set the receiver back like it might break if he hurried it. He stood a moment longer, inventorying the little pains in his shoulders, the way cold tends to get inside old injuries when the temperature drops. Ranger's tail ticked once, slow as if marking time. "You heard him," Jack said, and the dog's eyes brightened. There was no thrill in it. Ranger didn't meet trouble with joy, but there was purpose. And purpose is a warm coat. Jack moved with the efficiency that had been worn into him like a groove field kit from the hall closet unzipped to breathe. Folding stretcher slid behind the truck's bench seat, a compact CO2 monitor he'd bought himself after the counties had failed on a training day, a roll of fluorescent survey tape, not because he liked ribboning the world, but because sometimes the difference between chaos and memory is a line a man can follow back. He filled 2 thermoses coffee for himself, warm chicken broth for anyone he might find with hands shaking too hard to hold a spoon. He paused at the gun locker, then shut it with a click and left it be. Tonight wasn't about adversaries. It was about angles and gravity and patience. Ranger paced once to the mudroom and back, a silent question. Jack crouched and checked the dog's harness. The reflective strips, the quick-release clips, the small pouch that held a half roll of gauze and a muzzle he hoped not to use. He rubbed the dog's chest in a slow arc. We go in slow. We listen more than we move. Ranger angled his head, catching every syllable as if meaning had a scent. Jack stepped out to the porch and was met by the cold clean enough to sting. The sky had cleared itself of color. The earth gave back a hush. Gravel popped under the boots he'd resoled last summer, leather weathered to the softness of trust. He swung into the '06 Chevy, a truck that started on bad mornings and didn't lie about its gas gauge, and Ranger leapt in after settling with his front paws planted ready but never restless. As the tires found County 12, the radio coughed static, then Sheriff Talbot's voice rode in on it. Road crew salted the first mile. After that, it's on you. It's always on me, Jack said, and allowed himself the hint of a smile so small it barely reached the corner of his mouth. They rolled past dark fields crusted in frost, past a farmhouse window where a television flickered blue across a tidy room. Jack imagined the people inside a retired couple maybe arguing softly about whether to let the dog on the couch. He let the picture anchor him. The worst work still happens in a world that makes dinner, that folds laundry, that shoos a cat from the counter. He thought briefly of his ex-wife in Boise, remarried now, kind man, steady work at the post office. They'd parted without meanness, but the absence had never learned to stop knocking. You're not missing anything, he told the road, and in the dim cabin light, Ranger lifted one ear. Don't look at me like that, Jack murmured. You know what I mean. The asphalt narrowed, then surrendered to gravel, then to dirt packed hard by dump trucks that had gone back and forth all fall. Jack kept the tires in the high line, feeling with his hands as much as with his eyes, guiding the truck as though the road could be persuaded. He thought about the Briar Hollow spur, about the way old timbers remember the weight that broke them, about the modern habit of believing a stamped form changes physics. He'd seen good men bet their lives on paper. Paper always blinked first. Ranger's nose worked the air at the cracked window. The dog wasn't hunting scent. He was inventorying the world, the mineral tang of crushed rock, the colder note of water standing in ruts, a trace of diesel that spoke of machinery left cooling, perhaps in a hurry. Ranger huffed once, a sound like a considered opinion, and Jack reached to lower the radio. Some men fill the drive with talk to keep fear small. Jack kept quiet to make room for what might be trying to speak. 4 miles out, the county's floodlights began to rim the trees, a dull sodium glow against the low clouds. The site had been set up in the way sites are set up when budgets have to show vinyl banners promising revitalization, a chain-link panel fence with bright warning signs, a porta-john listing like a tired sailor. 2 pickup trucks idled by the trailer office, exhaust drifting in straight columns that told Jack the wind hadn't decided what to do yet. Sheriff Talbot stepped out of a unit with a hand tucked into his jacket, his breath a steady metronome in the cold. He was a big-shouldered man who'd learned posture more from lifting hay than from academies. You made time, he said, not quite gratitude, not quite relief, and reached to scratch Ranger's chest the way a man seeks to borrow courage. What did the contractor say? Jack asked, scanning. He clocked a generator chugging a little rough, a pallet of bags half-tarped in angle iron whose rust told an older story than the project's press release. Said the guys probably ducked a dead zone, Ed replied. Said the internal check-ins were fine. Said a lot of things that lined up like fence posts until you look at the ground between them. Jack nodded. He didn't waste temper on lies that had work sites to run. He saved it for the moments when stubbornness dressed up as leadership. He knelt and fitted Ranger's headlamp, a narrow beam he used not to light the world, but to read it dust plumes in the air, how they rose and fell on a breath, the glitter that told of freshly scuffed quartz. He tightened his gloves and glanced once more at the sky. No heroics, Ed said, as if the word could be traded like a poker chip. We go as far as sense allows. Jack looked up, gray eyes clear and calm. Sense is farther than most men think, he said. He could feel the tunnel already not in his bones. That's something people say when they want poetry, but in the small muscles along his jaw and how his hearing stretched for the frequencies that mean weight shifting on unseen fulcrums. Ranger leaned forward, a living arrow, and Jack rose. We'll check the mouth, he said, then choose. He didn't say out loud what the choosing always costs. He didn't need to. Ed fell in behind at an angle that gave Jack room, a quiet respect born from years of calling each other at bad hours. They walked toward the portal together, boots crunching in time, the dark ahead shaped like a question that hadn't learned to soften. Jack Rourke walked with the deliberate calm of a man who had spent too many nights weighing silence against consequence. His boots pressing a slow rhythm into the frost as he and Sheriff Ed Talbot closed the distance to the black mouth of the Briar Hollow Tunnel. The floodlights behind them hummed, throwing long shadows that wavered on the fence line, but as they neared the portal, the noise of the generator seemed to fade, and the world narrowed to the cold arch of stone ahead. Ranger pulled slightly on the lead, not with impatience, but with intent. The dog's amber eyes locked forward, ears angled like instruments tuned to a pitch only he could hear. Jack felt the leash vibrate with restrained urgency and let Ranger guide the line to a cluster of rusted rail ties stacked at the edge of the old track bed. The shepherd slowed, pressed his nose toward a particular beam, then backed a step with a sharp exhale that puffed white into the chilled air. Jack crouched, one gloved hand braced on his knee, and leaned close enough to see a faint plume of dust rising not in a chaotic swirl but in steady, almost metronomic pulses drifting upward as though the ground itself were breathing. His eyes narrowed, memory pulling back years to an Afghan culvert where similar dust had told him a wall was flexing under hidden pressure. He placed 2 fingers above the rail, held them still, and felt the faintest stir of moving air. Not wind, he murmured, his voice low but firm. That's displacement. Ed Talbot leaned closer, squinting at what looked like nothing more than a trick of light. Displacement. Jack nodded, eyes still fixed on the slow rhythm of falling dust. Rock shifting somewhere deeper. Every squeeze forces air out. It rides fractures until it finds the weak seams. This tie just happens to mark one. He straightened slowly, his face set in the expression of a man who had learned to trust what small signs say before the roar proves them right. From his vest pocket, he drew the compact CO2 monitor thumb, flicking the switch until the green diode winked alive. The unit hummed, then the digital readout flickered, numbers rising faster than he liked. Not methane, not carbon monoxide, but carbon dioxide climbing past baseline. He lifted the display so Ed could see. See that curve, he said. That's not gas intrusion. That's pressure squeezing air out of voids. Stone's moving in there. Ranger's body stayed rigid, head tilted toward the blackness of the portal tail, low but steady. The dog had not given a bark or growl. His silence was heavier. Jack recognized it, the same silence before an IED's buried charge revealed itself, not with noise but with a vibration you felt through your ribs. He set the monitor back, eyes scanning the rim of the tunnel. The contractor had sprayed shotcrete in wide bands along the portal, a fresh gray sheen against the darker stone, but Jack saw hairline fractures feathering out from the corners where old timber met new patchwork. He pressed his gloved hand to one seam. The cold stone quivered, not enough for sight, but enough for the skin to read. You patch the surface, Jack said, his voice edged with quiet contempt, and the mountain laughs at you underneath. Ed shifted uneasily, adjusting his hat against the night air. Jack. You think it's already giving? Jack's gaze moved to Ranger, who had sat now not in rest but in vigil body, square to the entrance, nose testing the air again and again. The dog's chest rose in deliberate, measured breaths, as if weighing the rhythm against memory. "It's giving," Jack said. He stepped closer to the dark arch, lowered himself to one knee, and placed a survey flag just inside the lip-bright tape fluttering faintly. "That's where safe ends," he murmured, more to himself than to Ed. He reached back and drew a small stick of chalk, marking a line across the stone at shoulder height. "If we hear snap before dusk, we fall back here. Nothing past this line is guaranteed." The sheriff rubbed his chin eyes, darting toward the trucks idling beyond the fence. "Contractors swore the bore was stable, said it passed inspection last fall." Jack let out a slow breath through his nose. "Inspections pass what they're told to look at. Rock doesn't sign forms." He adjusted Ranger's harness, clipping the leash short. The dog leaned forward but did not strain his discipline, as steady as his instinct. Jack glanced once at the monitor again, numbers creeping. The air felt thicker now, not suffocating but heavy, like a crowded room where every breath waited its turn. He could almost taste the metallic edge of shifting stone, though he knew it was more memory than science. "We go careful," he said, his tone even but final. "We're walking into something that's already decided to fall. The only question is whether it waits for us." Ed swallowed and gave a single nod, trust plain in the set of his shoulders. Together they faced the dark, the sheriff adjusting his flashlight beam, Jack pocketing the monitor where he could feel its hum against his chest. Ranger shifted his weight forward, one paw resting half an inch beyond the chalk line, his eyes never leaving the shadowed void. The tunnel narrowed as Jack, Rourke, Sheriff, Ed Talbot, and Ranger pressed farther into the blackness, their beams of light tracing across steel bolts and plates that had been drilled into the rock decades ago. Each sound seemed magnified, the crunch of gravel under their boots, the slow drip of water from somewhere above, and the faint hum of air shifting through fractures too small to see. Jack measured his breaths, counting the rhythm like a man pacing himself for a long march. Ranger walked a half step ahead, tethered by the short leash clipped to his harness. His paws sure on the uneven ground, his body balanced and ready. Ed's flashlight beam swept cautiously, sometimes catching flecks of mica that glimmered like false stars, reminders that beauty and danger often shared the same space underground. 20 meters in, Ranger halted so suddenly that Jack felt the leash jerk in his hand. The shepherd's body stiffened, his tail dropped low and his hackles lifted along his spine like bristles rising against an unseen current. Jack knew this language well. He had trusted Ranger's warnings in Helmand when the dog had caught the shift of earth above a hidden pit, and in Colorado years later when Ranger had stopped him a breath before an unstable ledge gave way. Jack froze mid-step, his boot suspended in air. A second later, the tunnel itself gave voice to its discontent. First came a sharp metallic ping like a hammer striking iron, then a prolonged groan as the bolt overhead sheared under pressure. The sound grew into a tearing scream that reverberated through the confined space, and before Jack could even lower his foot, the ceiling let go. A block of stone, wide as a pickup hood and jagged as broken glass, tore loose and plunged downward. The impact slammed into the tunnel floor with a force that rattled Jack's bones and sent shockwaves through the air. Dust erupted in a choking cloud, blinding their lamps, turning the world into a storm of gray grit. Ranger lunged against Jack's leg, pressing close while Jack dropped low, his arm shielding the dog's head from falling fragments. The blast of displaced air struck Sheriff Talbot square in the chest, forcing him to stagger backward, his flashlight beam spiraling wildly across the dust-filled dark. His voice rose, strained. "You all right?" Jack coughed once. Eyes narrowed against the haze. His voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "We're fine. Hold still until it clears." They crouched together, the silence punctuated only by the settling of debris. the slow rain of smaller stones and the rasp of their breathing. When the dust finally thinned, Jack lifted his headlamp and turned toward the path they had just traveled. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicion. The bore behind them was no longer open. Where the faint glow of floodlights had once traced the outline of the entrance there, now stood a wall of collapsed stone, jagged and seamless. A barrier formed in an instant. No trace of outside air filtered through. No glimmer of night beyond the portal. They were sealed inside. Ed's jaw tightened, his voice low, almost reverent in disbelief. That was the only way back. Jack studied the collapse for a long moment, scanning the fractures, gauging the weight pressing down. He shook his head slowly. That door's gone. Even if we had machinery, we wouldn't cut through before the rest comes down. Ranger nosed the air once, then pivoted forward, his body angled toward the unbroken stretch of tunnel ahead. He didn't look back, didn't question. His instincts understood what Jack's training confirmed retreat was no longer an option. Jack rose, brushing grit from his jacket, and laid his palm briefly on Ranger's shoulders. "We go forward," he said, his voice level, not meant to inspire but to affirm. Ed exhaled through his teeth, his flashlight steadying as he accepted the truth. Then, forward it is. Together, they began to move their steps slower, more deliberate now that the mountain had shown its first betrayal. The air grew heavier with each yard, dust still hanging like an invisible weight. Jack checked his CO2 monitor again. The numbers were higher than before, climbing in a slow, steady curve. He tucked it back into his vest, feeling the hum against his chest like a second heartbeat. He knew the signs the tunnel wasn't finished collapsing. Pressure was building voids, shifting, waiting for the next moment of surrender. They advanced, and Jack's eyes caught the details. Others might miss a hairline crack feathering outward from a bolt, a damp streak that cut down the wall at an unnatural angle, gravel scattered in patterns that spoke of fresh vibration. He marked each with a mental note, a private map of risks that only experience could draw. Ranger paused often, nose pressed near the walls, ears twitching at whispers too subtle for men. Each time the shepherd halted, Jack halted too, trusting the animal's unspoken report more than any sensor. Ed spoke once, his voice subdued, almost as if he feared the tunnel might overhear. "You ever get used to this feeling?" Jack answered without looking back. "No. You just learn to listen faster." His words hung in the dust-heavy air, stark and true. Deeper in the floor dipped slightly, the gravel giving way to packed clay. The walls narrowed, drawing them into a funnel that forced Jack to hunch slightly, his shoulders brushing stone that felt colder than before. He tested each step, careful not to disturb loose rock, while Ranger moved like liquid shadow, each paw deliberate, each pause weighted with meaning. Jack thought briefly of the men trapped farther inside the reason he was here. He wondered if they had felt this same warning, if they had heard the groan of bolts before the collapse cut them off. He imagined their lamps flickering in the dark, their hands pressed against stone, waiting for voices that might never come. The image sharpened his resolve. He adjusted his grip on Ranger's leash and pressed forward. Behind them, silence had replaced the world outside. Ahead, the tunnel exhaled in faint drafts, a living reminder that the mountain was not still. They were now part of its shifting, breathing body, caught inside a question with only one answer left to chase. Jack squared his shoulders, eyes fixed on the darkness, his voice steady as he spoke words Ranger already seemed to know. "We follow the only road left." The deeper Jack Rourke and Sheriff Ed Talbot moved into the suffocating black, the more the tunnel revealed its dishonesty. The silence broken only by the scrape of boots against gravel and the soft click of Ranger's claws. Their lamps cast narrow cones that traced the ribbed supports overhead beams, occasionally catching flecks of mica like tiny stars imprisoned in stone. Jack carried the folded county map in a plastic sleeve tucked inside his vest, a map that declared the bore was straight with no deviations. Nothing but a narrow shaft driven clean through the hillside in the 1950s. Yet as they advanced beyond 50 meters, his eyes caught something. The paper never confessed a row of timbers, thick and squared, set at angles long before modern bolts had been driven. The wood was weathered, scarred with tool marks that spoke of hands that had labored half a century earlier, perhaps more. He paused, lifted his headlamp, and let the beam linger over the grain. This was not 1950s work, These supports were older cut in the 1940s style he had seen in mines abandoned across Montana. He touched the wood with his glove, feeling the dry, splintered edge, and said quietly, "This shouldn't be here." Ed leaned closer, scanning the crude beams, his brow furrowed. County records said they bored straight. No mention of extra branches. Jack stepped back, sweeping the lamp along the wall where the timbers marked a seam, a narrow cut slanting off from the main shaft. Dust and rock filled most of it, but enough remained to reveal what was once a passage. "They lied, or they buried it," Jack murmured. "This branch wasn't on any map." Ranger sniffed the seam ears tilted forward, his body low, his nose pressing near the faint draft escaping from the gap. The shepherd gave a low exhale, a signal Jack recognized as interest, not alarm. Jack studied the angle and marked it silently in his mind. Whoever charted the map had chosen omission, not ignorance. They pressed on the tunnel, tightening the walls, whispering with faint vibrations that unsettled even Jack's practiced calm. He listened to the rhythm of the place, the way every sound returned to them. Short echoes clipped as though swallowed by unseen hollows. The farther they moved, the more the air grew damp, carrying a subtle metallic tang. Then came the drip. At first soft, irregular, like a faucet not shut tight. Jack's beam caught the shine as droplets fell from overhead, splattering dark spots onto the clay floor. He extended his hand, catching one on his glove, rubbing it between his fingers. His brows drew together. It wasn't cold. The water was warm. That detail tightened something in his chest more than the collapse behind them had. "Groundwater should be cold in this season," he said, voice low but urgent. Ed tilted his light upward, watching the ceiling glisten. "So what does warm mean?" Jack's tone carried no comfort. "It means the aquifer's under pressure. That heat isn't surface, it's friction from water forced against thin stone. The layer between us and the flow is failing." He pointed with his lamp to the spreading wet marks above lines that branched like veins. "When it gives, it won't trickle. It'll rip this tunnel open like paper." Ranger growled softly, not aggressive but uneasy, pacing beneath the wet seam head, tilting each time a drop landed near his paws. Jack drew the county map from his vest, snapping open the sleeve. He unfolded it under the beam, his gloved finger tracing the printed line. "According to this, we're on a straight run, nothing but rock above. But reality tells me there's a saturated bed pushing through right here." He folded the paper, his jaw tightening. "The map's a lie, Ed. Either they didn't want it known, or they didn't bother checking." The sheriff's voice carried both anger and disbelief. "They built this knowing water was pressing down. That's more than negligence." Jack didn't answer, but the grim line of his mouth was enough. He had seen cover-ups before, places where profit stood taller than truth, and the mountain always collected its due eventually. The sound of dripping grew steadier, a rhythm now, the droplets striking stone with more urgency. Jack felt the air shift cooler against his cheeks, though the water itself stayed warm. Pressure was building the tunnel, preparing to give. He motioned Ranger forward, careful to keep clear of the wettest section. Ranger obeyed instantly, moving with disciplined caution, ears flicking back toward the sound as though marking it for memory. Jack and Ed followed their beams, cutting through thicker dust, their boots crunching against gravel now slicked with moisture. As they pressed deeper, Jack's thoughts worked with relentless clarity. The false map meant one thing. There were other branches, other secrets cut into this hillside. The older timbers had marked a path once traveled and deliberately hidden. The warm drip overhead warned that the main shaft itself was becoming a trap. Somewhere ahead, beyond the lies and fractures, there had to be an answer. An alternate route, a way to escape before the mountain erased the rest of the tunnel in one catastrophic collapse. Jack placed his hand once more on Ranger's harness, grounding himself in the dog's steady presence. The shepherd leaned slightly forward, nostrils flaring, body reading the air as if it carried signals no man could measure. Jack breathed deep, the scent of damp clay and iron heavy in his lungs. "Let us right, boy," he whispered. Ranger's ears flicked once, then forward, guiding them deeper into the uncertainty the county map had denied. The steady rhythm of dripping water still echoed behind them when Jack Rourke and Sheriff Ed Talbot pushed farther into the suffocating dark Ranger, leading with the kind of sure-footed caution that no map or tool could match. The shepherd's nose worked constantly, ears flicking at sounds too subtle for human perception, and Jack trusted every pause, every subtle lean. The false map and the warm seep overhead had already told him this tunnel carried secrets buried deeper than stone. Now the silence shifted not with rock or water, but with something else. Something human. It was faint at first, a broken sound that seemed almost swallowed by the damp air, like wind caught in a hollow pipe. Jack froze one hand, shooting up to halt Ed while Ranger's head tilted sharply, ears pricked forward. There it was again, a muffled groan, followed by a weak voice barely carrying down the corridor. Jack moved forward in a crouch, guiding Ranger by the harness, his lamp beam sweeping ahead until the light fell on two figures slumped against the wall just beyond a bend. Both men were covered in dust, their faces streaked with grime, their eyes wide and glassy in the lamplight. One clutched his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, the other cradled an arm held stiff against his chest. Relief flickered across their faces when Jack's light found them, but it was tempered by pain so raw it pulled at the edges of their expressions. Jack knelt quickly, his voice calm but firm. "You're alive. That's what matters. Tell me what happened." The man with the broken leg swallowed hard. His lips cracked, his words ragged. "We told them not to push. We warned the foreman the seams weren't holding. But they kept ordering us deeper. Said the readings were fine, said we'd finish the survey by tonight." His voice trembled with anger as much as exhaustion. The other man nodded weakly, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. "We didn't want to go further, but they said our jobs depended on it. When the first collapse came, everyone scattered. We fell back here." He winced, adjusting his injured arm. "The rest, we don't know." Ed crouched beside them, his expression grim, his voice edged with disbelief. "They forced you forward, knowing the risks." Both men nodded, eyes downcast. Jack studied their faces carefully, noting not only what they said, but what they avoided. His years of reading men in interrogation tents and busted motels taught him that silence often shouted louder than words. Each time the subject of the collapse surfaced, both men's gazes flicked away, not toward the dark ahead, but back toward the passage that had sealed behind. They avoided it with a discipline that made Jack's instincts sharpen. He pressed his tone level, not confrontational. "When the rock came down, did you see anything else? Anyone else?" The injured worker with the broken arm shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to his companion before answering. "No, just noise. Dust. We ran." But his voice cracked on the last word and Jack caught the tremor. Ranger's body stiffened, nose lifting toward the sealed path behind them, ears locked on what memory might still cling to the dust. The dog gave a low, uneasy whine, subtle but telling. Jack felt the sound vibrate through the leash, confirmation that something unspoken lingered in the silence of that collapse. Jack kept his voice even, but his eyes bore into the men. "You're avoiding looking back. That tells me there's something there you don't want to name. I don't need every detail right now, but know this, we can't walk blind. Whatever you're not saying could cost lives." The man with the broken leg lowered his head, his jaw tight, but no words came. His silence was as heavy as the mountain pressing around them. Jack didn't press further, not yet. He shifted to triage, pulling a field bandage from his pack. He splinted the broken arm with practiced efficiency, his hands steady even as dust trickled intermittently from overhead. He then examined the twisted leg, wincing inwardly at the swelling. "He won't be walking on this," Jack said quietly to Ed. "We'll need to fashion a drag or carry." Ed nodded, his face pale beneath the beam of his lamp. Ranger stayed close, sniffing each injured man carefully, then settling between them with his body angled toward the collapsed entrance, his posture protective yet restless, as though guarding against something unseen. As Jack worked, the truth gnawed at him. The county map had lied, the supports had whispered of hidden branches, and now these survivors spoke of orders that defied reason. And still there was their silence about the collapse. Men did not avoid a direction unless something there had marked them with fear deeper than rockfall. Jack tied the last bandage, his gray eyes sweeping once more toward the blocked shaft. Dust still lingered faintly in the air, as if the collapse had not fully settled, as if the mountain itself carried memory of what else might have moved within it. He rose, brushing grit from his gloves, and tightened his grip on Ranger's harness. "We keep going forward," he said firmly. "But when we do, we stay sharper than ever. There's more in this tunnel than stone, and these men know it even if they won't say it." Ranger gave a low, steady breath, the kind of sound that told Jack his instincts were not alone. The injured workers leaned against the wall, their faces pale in the unsteady light, their voices rising in desperate pleas. "We have to go back one," said, clutching his splinted arm as though the thought of retreat might erase his pain. "The entrance may still be open somewhere, maybe through the service cut." The other, his broken leg stretched awkwardly on the gravel, shook his head and added, "Deeper is worse. We heard things moving after the collapse. Going forward is suicide." Their fear was raw, sharpened by wounds and fatigue, but Ranger paid them no mind. The shepherd lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing with intensity, then lifted his head toward the left wall where a narrow seam ran jagged through the stone. His body stiffened, ears forward, tail held low but steady. Jack felt the leash tighten gently as the dog leaned into the direction of that fracture. He knew that posture. It was the same one Ranger had shown in Afghanistan when he caught the faintest trace of a hidden passage venting stale air. Jack crouched beside the seam, pressing his hand against the stone. A faint draft kissed his glove cool, but carrying the unmistakable pulse of moving air. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him there was space beyond. Ed watched, his expression caught between relief and worry. "Could be a dead end," he murmured. Jack shook his head slowly, eyes still on the shepherd. "Air doesn't move unless it has somewhere to go. He feels it. He's pointing us toward a way through." The workers protested again, their voices rising in panic. "No, that's nothing. We tried checking before. There's nothing down that way. You'll only waste time. Go back, please." Jack's gaze hardened. "You're afraid of what's behind us more than what's ahead. That tells me all I need to know." He placed a hand on Ranger's harness and nodded. "We follow him." The shepherd pressed forward, paws scraping at the edge of the seam until loose gravel shifted aside, revealing a crack just wide enough for a man to wedge through sideways. Jack slid his lamp closer, peering into the narrow throat of stone. The draft carried fine dust motes with it shimmering in the light. He pulled a pry bar from his pack, wedging it into the seam and levering against the stubborn edge until the rock groaned and gave an inch more space. Ranger slipped through. First his body gliding into the dark with practiced agility. Jack followed, shoulders scraping against the stone, every movement careful but steady, until the passage widened on the other side. They emerged into a narrow chamber lined with rusted ductwork, the air heavier with the metallic tang of machinery long unused. Jack's lamp swept across a row of grates, and then he saw it, the frame of a ventilation fan, its blades still, its motor caked in dust. He moved closer, crouching to inspect it. The unit hadn't failed from collapse. There were no bent blades, no crushed casing. Instead, the wires dangling from the housing told a different story. The insulation was sliced clean, not frayed. Someone had cut them deliberately. Ed leaned over his shoulder, his voice low, almost a whisper. "That wasn't the mountain." Jack nodded grimly, running his gloved fingers along the severed wires. No accident. Someone wanted this fan dead. He traced the cable back along the wall, noting where dust patterns had been disturbed, places where boots had scuffed long before the collapse. His mind turned over possibilities with soldier's clarity. Disabling ventilation meant controlling air, cutting off routes, sealing men inside. It meant intent. Ranger circled the chamber nose, pressed close to the ducts, his body tense, a low hum vibrating from his chest. Jack watched him carefully. The dog paused near a grate, sniffed deep, then sat back with ears, pricked eyes locked on Jack. There was still airflow, faint but real, passing through alternate shafts. Jack rose, brushing dust from his knees, his gray eyes steady. "This vent leads somewhere," he said, "and it's still breathing. Whoever cut the wires wanted men trapped, not saved. That tells me there's more ahead than stone." The workers had followed awkwardly, one limping with Ed's support, the other dragging his injured leg across the floor. Their faces were pale in the light, and neither would look directly at the fan. Jack read the avoidance instantly, the same way he had noted their silence about the collapse. They knew more than they spoke. He didn't press them now. The truth would surface soon enough. He turned instead to the shepherd, laying a hand on the dog's shoulders. "You found it, boy. You always do." Ranger leaned forward, sniffing once more, then angled his body toward the far grate as if urging them onward. Jack straightened, his voice calm, but edged with resolve. "We take the vent path. It's narrow, and it won't be easy with the injured, but it's the only line that still breathes. And if someone tried to hide it, then it's the road they didn't want found." Ed nodded slowly, eyes scanning the severed wires, the weight of realization heavy in his posture. "Somebody set this," he said. Jack's reply was steady, his voice low. "Yes. And that means we're not just fighting the mountain anymore." The chamber seemed to tighten around them, the silent fan a grim sentinel of sabotage. Ranger held his post near the grate, his body taut with instinct, his loyalty as unwavering as the draft that whispered of a path beyond. Jack adjusted his pack, checked his lamp, and prepared to lead them deeper into the dark the county map had denied. The discovery of the severed wires hung in the chamber like a sentence unspoken, the silent fan above them bearing witness to sabotage older than dust. Jack Rourke wiped grit from his gloves and pulled his radio from its pouch, his thumb steady as he pressed the call button. "Command, this is Rourke. We've located survivors. Repeat, we have 2 alive. Tunnel unstable. Request immediate relay." Static crackled, hissed, then broke with a voice that wasn't Sheriff Ed Talbot's nor any dispatcher Jack had ever known. "The tunnel has collapsed," the voice said with deliberate calm, each syllable slow and certain. "No one made it out. Market closed." The air seemed to tighten in Jack's lungs, and even Ranger's body stiffened, ears flicking back as though he sensed the wrongness carried in the tone. Jack released the button and exchanged a sharp glance with Ed, who shook his head in disbelief. "That wasn't dispatch." Ed muttered, his jaw set. Jack keyed the radio again, this time on a different frequency, but the reply was the same, a distorted voice repeating the same fatal message. "Collapse confirmed. 0 survivors." Then silence, heavy and final. The workers shifted uneasily, their faces paling further than injury had already drained them. One bit down on his lip hard enough to draw blood. Jack caught it immediately, the tremor of guilt riding in the man's posture. He crouched before them, his gray eyes, steady voice low but unyielding. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" The man with the splinted arm broke first, his voice cracking under the weight. They paid him. The contractor. He cut corners for months. No reinforcements, no real inspections. He took the money and signed off on everything. And when cracks spread, when we reported it, he told us to keep quiet or lose our jobs. His eyes darted toward the silent fan, then away as though ashamed to meet it. When the pressure rose, he had it disabled. Said ventilation wasn't necessary. Said we were exaggerating. But we knew without airflow, once the collapse started, nobody was supposed to live long enough to talk. Ed cursed softly under his breath, his anger restrained but sharp. So the collapse wasn't just negligence. It was the plan. The man with the broken leg nodded weakly, his face drawn. Evidence. All of it buried under stone. Injuries written off as casualties of a natural cave-in. He wanted it clean, no questions asked. Jack rose slowly, his hand steadying Ranger by the harness. The shepherd growled low, his amber eyes locked on the blocked shaft behind them as if sensing more than echoes in the silence. Jack's voice carried the weight of iron. "Then we're not trapped by accident. We're trapped by design." The workers bowed their heads, shame pulling their gaze downward. Ed's fists clenched tight around his flashlight, his voice tight with fury. People trusted them. Families trusted them. And they turned this tunnel into a coffin to cover their fraud. Jack's expression hardened, his features carved by the steady calm of a man who had seen betrayal dressed as command too many times before. Fraud doesn't kill stone. Sabotage does. And that means we're walking inside their lie. He stepped back toward the fan housing, running his fingers once more along the clean slice of copper wire. This wasn't neglect. This was a decision. Ranger leaned forward, nose working the grate that still carried faint drafts of unseen air. His posture was tense but focused, his body an arrow drawn toward the path they had yet to take. Jack looked at the dog, then at the men around him. "We don't wait for another message to bury us. We move. We take the vent path." His tone cut clean through the despair. Ed nodded once the weight of command clear in his acceptance. Jack holstered the radio, his thoughts already shifting forward. Whoever sat above ground marking them dead had underestimated one truth: as long as air still whispered through stone, and as long as Ranger's instincts held steady, survival was not yet surrendered. He adjusted his pack, drew a new strip of chalk from his pocket, and marked the chamber wall with a clear line. His record of where the lie ended and where the fight forward began. Ranger's nose pressed against the far wall of the chamber, his claws scratching at the planks as if the stone itself carried a secret. Jack swung his lamp toward him, the beam catching the rough outline of aged timber braced against the rock. The shepherd pawed insistently, ears flat and tail stiff, until the sound of wood splintering echoed faintly in the narrow chamber. Jack set his pack down, drew a small crowbar, and levered against the boards. With a crack and a cough of dust, the planks gave way to reveal a dark shaft rising above them. The scent of stale air pushed out faint but cool. He aimed his light upward and caught the shimmer of steel rungs bolted into the shaft wall. Relief flickered, but it vanished the moment his glove touched the first rung and rust flaked away like brittle paper. He shifted his weight gently, testing, and the metal shrieked under the pressure before snapping clean from the wall. The broken rung clattered down, striking the gravel at their feet with a dull finality. Ed let out a sharp breath. "That ladder's been dead for years." The injured workers looked up with hollow eyes, their silence heavy with despair. Jack steadied the lamp, studying the shaft's height, measuring the distance with a soldier's instinct. "It's still a way out," he said quietly. "But not the way it was built." He pulled rope from his pack, heavy-duty climbing line he had carried since his days overseas, and threaded it through the frame of his harness. Then, with practiced hands, he knotted together a makeshift seat from an old plank and 2 cross lengths of rope. His movements were precise, not hurried, the kind of calm that steadied men who had run out of faith. He looked to the worker with the shattered leg first. "You go up before any of us," Jack said, his voice low but certain. "We lower you carefully. You stay still. The rest of us will carry you the rest of the way once we're clear." The man protested weakly, fear edging his words, but Jack's eyes silenced him. With Ed's help, they bound him into the sling, securing knots at every corner. Jack braced himself, shoulders set as he fed the rope, hand over hand, lowering the man down into the shaft. The steel groaned faintly with each shift of weight, but the rope held steady and true. When the worker reached the lower platform of the vent, his shout rose faint but alive, and the other injured man exhaled a shaky prayer of relief. Jack pulled the rope back, tightening knots, this time fastening the man with the splinted arm. The descent was slower, the man's trembling making the rope sway, but Ed steadied the line and Jack's grip never faltered. Minutes later, he too reached the vent floor below, leaving only the 3 of them and Ranger above. Ed wiped sweat from his brow, his voice low but firm. "You go next, Jack. I'll anchor." Jack shook his head. "No. Ranger goes first." He turned to the shepherd, patting the side of his leg. "Up. Go with me." But Ranger refused to be lifted. When Jack reached to cradle him, the dog twisted free, planting his paws against the first intact rung. He looked up into the shaft, his body taut with determination, then began climbing not like a man, but with steady leaps, front paws gripping hind legs, pushing his claws, scraping metal. Jack steadied him, one hand on the rope, the other close enough to catch if the dog slipped. But Ranger never faltered. Each rung seemed to bow under his weight, yet he moved upward with an instinct born from years of trust in dangerous terrain. Jack followed closely, his boots braced against the shaft walls, his hands tight on the rope as a secondary line. Ed called up from below, his voice echoing, "Watch the 3rd rung left. It's rusted through." Jack nodded already, guiding Ranger past it, his hand pressing against the shepherd's flank. They rose in silence except for the creak of corroded steel and the soft rasp of Jack's breath. Every movement was measured, every sound magnified by the awareness that one misstep could send them crashing back into the dark. Halfway up, Ranger paused, ears pricking forward, nose working the air above. He gave a low growl, not of fear, but of warning, as if something unseen waited beyond the shaft's edge. Jack tightened his grip on the rope, his eyes narrowing. He whispered a word of reassurance, not for the dog, but for himself, and pressed upward again. The top of the shaft loomed nearer the vent grill, faint in the beam of his lamp, but bent inward, as though it had been forced once before. At last, Ranger clambered onto the lip, his claws scraping metal, his body pulling free into the narrow vent chamber. Jack hauled himself after muscles taut until his shoulders cleared the rim. He dropped onto the platform beside the shepherd, crouching low, as Ed's voice rose from below. "Your turn, Jack. Send the line back." Jack leaned over, lowering the rope, his gray eyes sweeping the space above. The air smelled fresher, tinged with the faint promise of surface. Yet the bent grill and Ranger's unease told him the climb had only opened another question not yet answered. The rusted shaft groaned with every movement, and Jack's lamp cast narrow beams that made the corroded steel shimmer like bone in the dark. Ranger moved above him with slow certainty, claws digging into each wrung body, balanced with the patience of instinct. Jack's breath came steady but controlled, every muscle taut as he anchored himself to the rope, one hand guiding the other, supporting Ed, who followed close behind. Below them, the injured workers clung to the sling line, their faith carried entirely by Jack's knots and Ed's watchful grip. For a moment it felt like momentum, like progress earned rung by rung. Then Ranger froze. The shepherd's body went rigid, muscles stiff as stone ears thrust forward with unnatural stillness. He did not look up or down, only locked himself in place with the absolute finality of a soldier halted by unseen command. Jack felt the leash tug tight and stopped without hesitation. Years in service had taught him that ignoring the dog's warning was never survival. He lifted his lamp to study Ranger's posture and felt his own chest tighten with unease. 10 seconds passed like an eternity silence, broken only by the faint scrape of boots on steel. Then the mountain roared. A deep, concussive crack erupted from below the sound, splitting the shaft like thunder trapped in stone. The shockwave surged upward, a brutal fist of air and grit rattling the ladder and tearing loose rust in showers. Had they climbed even one rung higher, the full force of the blast would have struck them head-on, hurling their bodies back into the void. Jack's hand locked around the rope, his muscles braced, as the shaft shook his lamp, swinging wildly in the chaos. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding the echoes of the explosion, reverberating through the stone like a drumbeat of destruction. When the first wave passed, Jack coughed hard, blinking against the stinging grit. Ranger still clung to the rung above, unmoving, his amber eyes wide but steady, his instincts having saved them by no more than inches. Jack exhaled slowly, a whisper of gratitude caught in the storm of dust. But the danger had not ended. The pressure shifted abruptly, the air pulling back with a strange vacuum, as though the tunnel itself inhaled. Dust and gravel lifted from the floor, spiraling upward in violent swirls, the reverse suction of collapsing voids, sucking air into the fresh cavity of destruction below. Jack recognized the deadly physics in an instant. A second wave was coming, and it would be worse than the first. Ranger moved before Jack could command. The shepherd lunged toward a narrow break in the shaft wall, a side vent barely wide enough for the dog's frame. He barked once, sharp and insistent, then thrust his body halfway inside claws, scraping metal tail rigid with urgency. Jack understood at once. The vent was shallow, but it offered shelter against the blast funnel about to tear through the shaft. He grabbed the rope and shouted down to Ed, his voice sharp but clear. Into the side vent. Now Ed looked up through the dust cloud, his face pale but his nod firm. He braced the injured man's sling and pushed forward his body, straining against the pull of air already dragging them upward. Jack hauled himself alongside Ranger, jamming his shoulder into the narrow vent, tugging at the others with a soldier's command that left no room for hesitation. The workers cried out, panic riding their voices as suction clawed at their legs. But Jack pulled with relentless strength, shoving one then the other into the shallow chamber. Ed followed, coughing violently, his coat whipped by the wind of pressure reversal. Ranger barked again, louder, his body angled across the vent's mouth, shielding them with the raw defiance of instinct. Jack shoved himself against the shepherd's flank, pressing the dog fully inside, then flattened his own frame over the opening just as the second wave hit. The blast tore through the shaft like cannon fire. A wall of compressed air roared upward, carrying shards of rock and steel, the force so violent it rattled Jack's teeth. The suction reversed in an instant into an upward surge, the vent's edge groaning under the pressure. Dust and debris screamed past, inches from their faces, close enough that Jack could feel the heat of friction across his skin. Ranger's body pressed hard against him, steady as an anchor. The shepherd's growl vibrated in Jack's chest, not from fear, but from the primal act of holding ground against nature's fury. Seconds stretched unbearably, then the wave passed, leaving silence heavier than any sound. Jack lifted his head cautiously, eyes sweeping the shaft beyond. The rungs below had vanished into a choking cloud of dust, the ladder ripped bare in places where steel had torn free. He knew then with iron certainty if they had climbed even half a step further without Ranger's pause, they would have been swept clean into the explosion's throat. He reached a hand to steady the shepherd, pressing against the dog's trembling flank, feeling gratitude stronger than words could shape. The workers gasped in the cramped vent, their eyes wide with terror, but alive. Ed leaned heavily against the wall, his chest heaving, his face streaked with soot. He met Jack's gaze and managed a faint, hoarse whisper. "That dog just saved us twice in one breath." Jack nodded once, his expression carved with resolve. and he'll do it again if we let him." The vent trembled faintly under their weight, reminding them that safety was still temporary. Jack adjusted the rope, securing the injured tighter against the line. He angled his lamp forward, finding the faint continuation of the vent duct leading deeper upward toward unknown ground. The shepherd licked dust from his muzzle, then moved forward without hesitation, his body already guiding the way into darkness that might yet carry light. The vent narrowed to the width of shoulders and ribs, but Ranger pushed ahead without hesitation, his paws scraping metal, his body leading with the stubborn certainty of a compass needle fixed to true north. Jack followed on his hands and knees, his lamp scraping overhead, his breath shallow from the stale air and the pressure still echoing in his chest. Behind him, Ed supported the injured workers, dragging them inch by inch, their weight heavy, yet their eyes wide with the hope of air and sky. The tunnel pressed them close, forcing silence except for the scrape of boots and the faint growl of the shepherd urging them forward. Then, after what felt like an endless crawl through stone and rust, the draft changed. The cold bit sharper, fresher, the kind of air only the surface can carry. Ranger barked once, the sound sharp and triumphant, then lunged against a grill that gave way with a screech of rusted bolts. A burst of frigid wind filled the duct, flooding their lungs with the taste of open ground. Jack pushed the shepherd through, first, then hauled himself out, collapsing onto gravel crusted with frost. For a long moment, he lay on his back, staring up at a sky still painted gray with dust, but alive with stars fighting through. Ed emerged next, dragging one worker, then another, until all 5 of them lay gasping on the cold earth. The silence of night was shattered by engines and shouts. Emergency vehicles stood scattered across the ridge headlights, carving beams into the mist. Uniformed deputies rushed forward, their relief breaking into hurried calls for stretchers. But the first voice Jack heard above the commotion was not the sheriff's. It was deeper, heavier, and far too smooth. "That's impossible," the man barked, his expensive coat catching the glow of the floodlights. "No one could have survived that collapse. The tunnel is sealed. I saw the reports myself." Jack sat up slowly, his gray eyes narrowing as recognition set in. Richard Hale, the contractor whose name had threaded through every whispered admission of negligence, stood among the officers, his face pale with the shock of seeing ghosts where he expected only rubble. He forced a quick recovery, his words sharp with false certainty. "Check again. These men must be mistaken. The system collapsed completely. There was no way through." Ranger growled low, his body pressed against Jack's leg. The dog's eyes locked on the contractor as though instinct had already judged him guilty. Jack rose unsteadily, brushing frost and dust from his jacket, then reached into his pack. He pulled free a length of copper wire, its ends cleanly sliced, held it up so that the floodlight glinted across its surface. "This was no collapse," Jack said, his voice steady, carrying across the ridge. "This was cut." He laid the wire on the hood of a patrol truck, then set a small device beside it, his handheld CO2 meter. The screen flickered numbers, frozen at the spike he had logged just before the blast. Levels rose before the fall, matching the pressure from forced collapse. It wasn't the mountain failing. It was someone making sure it failed. The deputies went silent, their eyes shifting between Hale and the evidence on the truck. Ed stepped forward, his voice rough but unyielding. "And we have witnesses. These men saw the shortcuts. They heard the warnings. They were ordered deeper when they begged to pull out." The injured worker with the splinted arm lifted his head weakly from the stretcher, his words strained but clear. "He told us to ignore it. He said it would hold. He knew it wouldn't." The other worker, face pale, whispered hoarsely. "He said no one would ask questions if the rock buried it all." Hale's composure cracked, sweat beading at his brow despite the cold. "They're confused. Injured. They don't know what they're saying." Jack stepped closer. Ranger pacing with him, the shepherd's growl vibrating through the night. "They're not confused," Jack said, his gray eyes burning steady. "And this dog knew before any of us that someone wanted us sealed inside. He led us to the truth, and the truth is that you turned this tunnel into a graveyard to cover your tracks." The sheriff finally arrived, his face lined with both relief and fury. He looked at Jack, then at the men on stretchers, then at Hale, whose denials tumbled faster with every passing second. "That's enough," the sheriff said, his voice cutting like a blade. He signaled 2 deputies who stepped forward, their cuffs catching the light. Hale sputtered, protesting, but the evidence was undeniable. The wires, the readings, the testimonies. The deputies secured him, leading him toward the cruiser as his words collapsed into silence. Jack exhaled slowly, the weight of hours in the dark finally easing from his shoulders. Ranger sat beside him, tongue-lolling, eyes bright but watchful, as though still guarding even in safety. The workers were loaded into ambulances, Ed receiving a blanket and a pat on the shoulder, his fatigue finally showing now that the fight was over. Jack crouched, pressing his hand into the shepherd's fur, feeling the steady thrum of loyalty beneath it. "You did it, boy." He whispered the words, carrying gratitude that needed no answer. The ridge grew quieter as the vehicles prepared to move, but the sky above had cleared, revealing stars sharp and bright over the Montana hills. Jack looked once more at the tunnel's scar in the earth, now sealed by both stone and truth. The mountain had tried to claim them, but it had also given them the proof they needed. Justice would carry forward, and the men who thought silence could be buried would learn otherwise. Ranger leaned against him, warm despite the cold, his amber eyes reflecting the light of the flood lamps like a beacon. Jack straightened his posture firm, his gray eyes lifted toward the horizon. The storm of stone was behind them, but the path of accountability had just begun. And in the silence that followed, he knew with certainty that survival meant more than breath. It meant making sure the truth could no longer be buried. Thank you for watching this story of survival, loyalty, and justice. Which moment struck you most? The Marine's decision to trust his dog, the tunnel's violent collapse, or the final reveal of the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more tales that remind us of the strength of courage, loyalty, and brotherhood.